Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us at the Microsoft Fabric UK user group. I'm your host, Leon Gordon, and I'm here with my co-host, Pragati Jain.
Hey everyone. Hi Leon, how are you?
Fantastic. Thank you. How about yourself?
Yeah, good, doing good. Just down with little cold, but I guess it's just the weather thing going on.
Yes, indeed, indeed. Hopefully it can get warmer very, very quickly. And I hope you
Yeah,
feel better
hopefully.
soon as well, Pragati.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Leon.
Excellent. And as usual, if everybody can let us know where you're joining us from in the world today, this is going to be our last session of 2024. And we wanted to end it on a bang. Okay, so today's session is Microsoft Fabric and Azure DevOps by none other than fellow Microsoft Data Platform MVP, Kevin Chant. So I'll give a brief introduction to Kevin before I let him go into a bit more detail. So Kevin is a data engineering manager based in the Netherlands, or Holland as it's often referred to as well. And he's a Microsoft certified trainer. And as I mentioned, a Microsoft Data Platform MVP, specializing in Microsoft Fabric. Hi, Kevin. Thank you very much for joining us.
Hey Kevin.
Hi.
Excellent. Very much looking forward to your session today, and I'm sure everybody joining us is as well. So we'll hand over to you to get straight in.
Thank you very much. So hopefully my screen is sharing now for everybody. There you go. So hi everybody. Welcome to today's session, Microsoft Fabric and Azure DevOps. Story so far as we end 2024. So just to manage some expectations for everybody today. There are posts available for a lot of the demos that I show in today's session because I do go through some of them at a fast pace. Everything you see today will be shown on a trial tenant, so there will be no NDA material. And it does include details relating to the new-ish Microsoft CI/CD workflows document. And yes, SQL database in Fabric, like it says in the abstract, will be covered in this session as well. So the agenda today, I do the obligatory bio, then I'll do an introduction to Microsoft Fabric very quickly, because I'm sure a lot of you have seen this by now. Then I'll do an introduction to Azure DevOps. Then I'll go through configuring Azure repos for Git integration. Then I give context to using Azure DevOps with the suggested CI/CD workflow options. And then finally, I'll talk about CI/CD for both Fabric Data Warehouse and SQL database in Fabric. So a bit about myself before we get started. Like it was mentioned earlier, I'm a data engineering manager in the Netherlands. However, as some of you can probably tell from the accent, I'm actually originally from the southwest of the UK. However, I live in the Netherlands due to the fact my wife is Dutch. So basically, I'm an Englishman living in the Netherlands, working for a large international consulting company because he met a woman in Australia. Now, if you kept up with that, you're in a good place for this session. So I've worked in IT for some time, and over the years, I've worked in various sectors, including a fair few in the UK. I have various certifications, and like it was mentioned earlier, I'm a Microsoft certified trainer and a data platform MVP as well. And you can find me online in a few different places, as you can see here on the slide, and as it has been just shared in the chat. And like I said, there are some posts relating to the demos. You can find those on my blog, where I post a lot about data platform and developer technologies. And I share a lot of repositories on my GitHub as well, which are relevant for the topics that I cover today. So I'll jump straight into an introduction on Microsoft Fabric for the benefit of anybody who wants to see a slightly different introduction. I'm sure by now a lot of you have seen a diagram similar to this one that represents the Microsoft Fabric architecture. At the top, you have the 4 pillars which Microsoft Fabric are based on. So basically, it's a comprehensive analytics platform. So you go to one website and everything's all available in one place. It's lake-centric and open because it has a unified storage solution. It empowers every business user because they can use tools that are familiar to them. In fact, if you watched the Fabric Digital launch video from last year, you'll see quite a good demo on there that shows PowerPoint. And it's AI powered, because I'm sure by now a lot of you are aware that there are multiple Copilot experiences within Microsoft Fabric. What you may not be aware is that there's actually now a Copilot experience available for SQL database in Fabric. And on that note, I have just realized that this architecture slide has left out databases. I do apologize, everybody. Was supposed to be the updated version, but I will show you it shortly. So when you're working with Fabric, I do recommend 2 additional groups of services to make the most out of it, which are Microsoft Purview for your compliance and governance needs, and either Azure DevOps or GitHub for your version control and CI/CD requirements. So as I mentioned earlier, there is a unified storage solution in Fabric. This is OneLake, and you can actually use OneLake Catalog to actually browse all your items that you have access to view basically in Fabric. And the premise is that you can either store files of any format in OneLake or other items such as nicely curated Delta tables that you can work with in lakehouses or data warehouses. So I'll just quickly go through the workloads now. So you have Data Factory, and this is where you orchestrate your data movement within Fabric, either through the use of data flows generally to be more specific, or data pipelines. Then you have Power BI, which is the same as before, only not, thanks to a lot of optimizations and innovations that have been introduced. That includes things like direct lake mode, etc. Then you have industry solutions, and this basically allows you to deploy the best way to describe them really is templates into a workspace to help you get up to speed quickly for delivering solutions in certain areas. So for example, either in healthcare or for manufacturing or retail or sustainability. And I've actually used the sustainability one myself. It comes with this very useful set of templates, also known as a capability, called ESG metrics. And that will deploy an entire environment for you that contains things like lake houses, notebooks, pipelines, etc., to help you quickly get started to ingest all of your environmental, social, and governance data. Now, as I mentioned, there is one workload that's absent from this particular set of slides, which I had fully updated. That is databases. And within databases at this moment in time is where you will find SQL databases in Fabric, which is exactly how it sounds. You can work with SQL Server databases directly within the Fabric platform without having to work with SQL Server on premises. So in essence, it's very similar to working with Azure SQL database. And I do cover this towards the end of the session. Then there's data engineering, and this allows you to work with the lakehouse paradigm at scale. So basically you can work with either raw files of any type or nicely curated Delta tables. Then there's data warehouse, and this allows you to use T-SQL to work with large data at scale. Then there's real-time intelligence, formerly known as real-time analytics. However, now it's been reimagined basically, and also includes what used to be known as Data Activator, which is now just known as Activator. So this is where you'd work with ingesting your real-time data and generating alerts on it. In addition to that, it also comes with its own real-time, so to speak, dashboard. So you can put tiles on there and visually display real-time data or metrics, at least relating to that data. Finally, there's data science, and this is where your data scientists can work together within a workspace. So basically the same as what used to be a Power BI workspace. And within that workspace, as well as sharing notebooks, they can also share models and experiments. And I think this is great. And there's some very nice additions that come with this workload in Fabric. So if you are curious about data science or you have a data science background, it is worth looking into. Anyway, as I'm sure some of you are probably aware of by now, one of the main benefits, really, I think, of Microsoft Fabric is that it removes friction, because in the past, a lot of us data platform professionals have had to do all the plumbing between lots of different services. Whereas now the premise is that we can do it within the Microsoft Fabric environment. And I'll very quickly show you all how it looks now. And I do mean very quickly because I'm sure a lot of you have already seen these demos. So this is Microsoft Fabric when you first go into it. And in fact, I'll make this a bit bigger for everybody. As you can see, here is the workload I was mentioning earlier, which does, for some reason, it's not on this particular slide. If I go and click on settings in the top right hand corner, you'll see it's very same options as what you got in the past of Power BI. And that's because Microsoft Fabric is based on the Power BI architecture. So if you've got a background with my Power BI, you're going to thrive in Fabric. If I select any of these workloads at all, so I will select Power BI, for example, you will see that all of a sudden I get to see lots of different items I've used in the past, and lots of new options appear. It is based on the Power BI architecture, so you still work with workspaces. So if I select, for example, here workspace, if I click on any of these workspaces, you will see that there are items here. And because this particular item is new and exciting for a lot of people, I thought I would quickly show SQL database and Fabric for you all. So there you go. So that is a very, very quick introduction of Microsoft Fabric. There is a lot of material about this online. I'm sure a lot of you have already seen a lot of sessions in this user group as well relating to it. And now let's go straight into Azure DevOps. Now, Azure DevOps manages your application lifecycle management, all the way from creating your initial work item all the way through to the release. In reality, Azure DevOps is a collection of services and applications which you can extend. So, for example, it has a service called Azure Repos, where you store your Git repositories, and Azure Pipelines, where you orchestrate all of your pipelines and related features. Now, there's two main versions of Azure DevOps. There's Azure DevOps Services, which is the cloud-based version, and there's Azure DevOps Server. And just for all of your information, Microsoft Fabric Git integration only currently supports Azure DevOps Services, which is the cloud-based version. And I've actually just seen a question appear on the chat, which is, can we mirror an on-premises SQL database in Fabric? And the answer is yes. And in fact, there was one article that showed how to do it a while back with transactional replication. And I do believe there are other ways that you can do it as well. And I've just seen another question for data ingestion, which is better, Data Factory or Data Lakehouse? Because they're currently using Lakehouse, but Data Factory may be a more appropriate option. So it does depend on your circumstances. Hopefully my moderator will very nicely find for me the guide by Microsoft on when you should use either data pipelines or data flows Gen 2 or notebooks, because notebooks are also an option as well, depending on your circumstances or a combination. Anyway, back to the topic at hand, and hopefully Pragati will be able to find that link for you. If not, go to either your search engine of choice or Copilot in Edge, and just ask for the guide for Microsoft Fabric data options, I do believe it's called, or something along those lines. And you'll know if it's the right one, you'll find a nice table. Anyway, I'm going to go to just quickly do an Azure DevOps demo for you all now. So this is Azure DevOps. When you first go into it, you have an icon in the top left-hand corner. This represents the account you're logged in as. In addition to that, the tenant as well, the Microsoft Entra tenant, by the way, I should say. And underneath the icon, you have the organizations that your account has currently got access to. And this can change if your account is logged in as a guest on another tenant, so be aware of that. Now, if you have the right permissions, you can change various settings at the organization level. This is probably relevant for those of you who've created your own organization to test things on at home, which you're more than able to do so. So if you're using the Microsoft Fabric trial from various different methods online, you can create your own Azure DevOps organization in the same tenant. So there's various options here in settings for the organization settings. A lot of these are intuitive. So for example, here's where you would add new users. Here's where you can connect or disconnect to a Microsoft Entra tenant. I should zoom in a bit here. And there's various other settings. One lot of settings I will point out in particular is related to working with Azure pipelines, because a while ago now, Microsoft introduced two settings to be able to disable the classic pipelines. And by that, I mean the GUI-based classic editor and the releases feature. So if you find when you're working in Azure DevOps within an enterprise that you can create these and you can't even find the options, this is probably why. I see this question appear a lot online, so I thought I'd better point this out. So like I said, there's various other settings here, and there is a lot of material online about what you can do with all these settings. Now, each organization has access to one or more projects in. And if I click on a project, you will see the default set of services you tend to get appear. So like I mentioned earlier, so we have Azure Boards, and this is where you manage your work items in Azure DevOps. You have Azure Repos, and this is where you visualize the Git repositories that are stored in Azure DevOps. So this is just a visual representation of a Git repository. So as you can see here, and if I go over Azure Repos, you'll see I've got a lot of different options here as well. Then we have Azure Pipelines, and this is where you manage all of your Azure DevOps deployment pipelines. And I stress Azure DevOps here because there's deployment pipelines in Microsoft Fabric as well. And I do appreciate that it can be a bit confusing for some people. So if you just stick to the terminology of pipelines in Azure DevOps, or say Azure Pipelines, and use Microsoft Fabric deployment pipelines, that will help reduce the amount of confusion there. So yeah, you have Azure test plans, and this is where you can manage your test plans without having to store them inside spreadsheets, which I find quite useful. And then artifacts, and this is where you can publish your artifacts directly into Azure DevOps. Now, just like with the organization settings, excuse me, you can manage various settings at the project level as well. And the reality is, if you work for an organization, this is probably the part you have the most influence over. And as you can see, there are various settings here. Again, a lot of these are quite intuitive. One thing I will say is that if you are going to create service connections to Azure services, please give them a user-friendly name. For example, if you're setting up a connection to a resource group in Azure, because if you don't, you can risk exposing things like your subscription ID in the service connection names. So that is a very quick introduction to Azure DevOps. And I have just glanced over to make sure there are no other questions in the chat. So we are doing quite well for time here. So next I want to talk about Microsoft Fabric Git integration. And this allows you to synchronize supported items in a workspace so that their metadata is synchronized with a Git repository. And to be more precise, it synchronizes the metadata for supported items in a workspace with a branch in a Git repository. So just to raise awareness about this, items are supported at various levels. And what I mean by that is, if you work, for example, with a Power BI report, behind the scenes, it will save a Power BI desktop project and all of the metadata associated with your report and semantic model. If you go to save a data warehouse or SQL database in Fabric, you will get a database project created behind the scenes, and you can use that to have all your changes synchronized between multiple workspaces if you wish to there. However, for lakehouses at this moment in time, it only stores the name of the lakehouse. So basically just a container itself. It doesn't store any details about any of the delta tables that you use in a lakehouse or any files, shortcuts, etc. Literally just a lakehouse name. So be aware of that. And Microsoft Fabric Git integration currently supports either Azure DevOps or GitHub. Well, actually, it supports both. It supports Azure DevOps, like I said, only supports the cloud-based version. It's also a similar thing applies to GitHub as well. So what GitHub calls github.com to represent all their cloud-based offerings. That includes GitHub personal use and GitHub Enterprise Cloud. They are all supported, but just be aware there are differences on how you work with Git integration between the two. And I have documented the differences in blog posts. And to use Microsoft Fabric Git integration, you need either a Fabric or a Power BI premium capacity purchased. And as you're probably aware of by now, there are some changes relating to Power BI premium capacities. And the reality is you probably should start looking at Fabric capacities in the near future. Anyway, as far as configuring Azure DevOps for Microsoft Fabric Git integration is concerned, it utilizes Microsoft Entra ID authentication. And just to help some terminology here, Microsoft Entra ID is what used to be known as Azure Active Directory. So when you're working with a Git integration, your Microsoft Entra account needs the relevant access to both the Microsoft Fabric workspace and the Azure DevOps repository behind the scenes. And your Microsoft Entra account, well, the user needs to be on the same tenant. However, the Azure DevOps organization just does not. So just be aware of that. So for example, I just showed you Azure DevOps earlier. One of the organizations I just showed you is actually on another tenant, which I'm a guest user on. So I just want you all to be aware of that. Speaking of things to be made aware of, here's some security considerations as far as working with Git integration is concerned. So, first of all, keep your organization and your repository in the relevant region. Now, this can be very important for a lot of people, especially where you've got certain regulations which say that your metadata has to be stored in a certain region. Because you can do this with Azure DevOps. You can create a Azure DevOps organization in a specific region?
Sorry, Kevin, just something came up as a question. So Muhammad is asking, is it possible to have the presentation that Kevin is using? And I'm assuming you'll
Certainly.
share
So,
that later.
as Pragati already knows, because we've co-presented together in the past, after every session that I present, I tend to share my slides on the repository that I have on my GitHub site. So if you get the link to my GitHub, just keep an eye out for the repository called Past Presentation. Morning for you with the slide, and I'll make sure that's known on LinkedIn so that it can be amplified for you all.
Yeah, so just to add, everyone, in the starting, I shared where you can follow Kevin. So I have shared his GitHub repository link as well. But yeah, I'll share it again. So as Kevin mentioned, you can find the presentation from there.
If you share the link
Kevin.
from my past presentation repository, Pragati, that will be the best one for everybody.
Sure.
And just will keep an eye on it then.
Yeah. Thanks, Kevin.
So for those of you who want to reduce the risk for data exfiltration, or for your sensitive information to be made public, like I was just saying, keep your organization private, don't make it public. And in addition to that, consider using what's known as GitHub Advanced Security for Azure DevOps, which can be quite useful. So for example, as some of you may know who've worked with data engineering in the past, now and again, people have been known to put their Azure Data Lake storage access keys inside notebooks. However, if you do that in a Fabric workspace that's got Git integration enabled, and if they synchronize and commit the change, those access keys will appear in the Git repository. However, what you can do is start looking to use GitHub Advanced Security, and that will prevent the commit, or the pushes, I should say, for those access keys. I know, I have tested this myself. I have shown this myself at a conference before. It is worth looking into. Just be aware though, when you enable it in Azure DevOps, it comes at a cost. Make sure you read the small print as well, because it does backdate the users from when they commit. I do remember correctly, either the last 30 or 90 days in the repository. So I see there's another question that's appeared in the chat as well, and you were about to tell me, weren't you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So we have got the question from Puddle Duck Valley. Okay, that's a interesting
Would
name.
you suggest after merging notebooks back into a main repository that a feature branch should be deleted and then recreated from main? I would go even further than that. Yes and no. Yes, you probably should remove that feature branch after use if it's not synchronized. You can, of course, alternatively just do a pull directly from your preceding branch, and I will show you these branches shortly. Depending on what strategy you're using for doing the deployments, you may not be using main, which is why I say no, because you may be using, for example, a development branch. If you're wondering why, give me about 5 to 10 minutes. So I will add a bit more clarity for that. But yes, once you finish with a feature, because a feature is supposed to be a short-term thing, once you finalize your feature, then yes, it is probably worth looking to remove your branch and workspace. And yes, I do appreciate it does mean you have to think of a process to do that. However, this is a recommended method. I do know a lot of companies are looking into this method. It is popular for a lot of good reasons, and it does align with the DevOps way of working, which I will show you some of this shortly. So yes, remove it. Main branch, depends how you're doing your deployment.
Thanks, Kevin.
That's fine. Anyway, I'm now going to do a Git integration demo. So if we go back into Microsoft Fabric, and I have a blank workspace, which I've imaginatively called blank workspace. So if you go to workspace settings in the top left-hand corner, you'll see you get all these workspace settings appeared. I'm not going to go through all of these. If you select one called Git integration, you'll see you get the option of selecting between either Azure DevOps or GitHub. If you select Azure DevOps and then you select your Entra account, which it says here AAD, but that basically means your Entra account that you're logged in as. Click on Connect, and all of this will be quite self-intuitive to fill in. So organization, so in our case, this would be the Azure DevOps organization. Project, so for example, the project that we were in earlier. Sorry, I got a bit carried away there. Then the Azure repos Git repository. So for example, just any particular one. And then branch. So here is quite interesting for you. Either you can select an existing branch you've got, or you can create a new. And then once you've done, you just click on Connect and Sync. And I've already done this in a few other repositories, and I will show you one I've done earlier. So this is one, and in fact, I've actually got a change here, so this is quite interesting. So I've already configured one. If I go to Workspace Settings and Git Integration, you'll see I've got this link to a feature branch. And because of that, I have source control up here. And if I click on the source control button, you'll see I've got two tabs, changes and updates. Changes represents any changes that you've done in your Fabric workspace. If you do any updates to the Git repository behind the scenes, it will appear in the Updates tab. So that's a good way to remember the difference between changes and updates. In addition to that, I have a nice little branch icon appear on the left-hand side. Let me just close on that a minute. I don't seem to have. Apologies, everybody. CMIT apparently has decided not to be of service right now. So on the left-hand side, I have a Git icon. If I click on there, I get an option to branch out to a new workspace. So if I want to, so say for example, if I was in a development workspace, and I can actually show that now to help you visualize this better. So let me go to my development workspace. So I go to source control, and I've got a workspace that represents a development environment connected to a dev branch. If I want to create a feature branch, I can just click on the branch icon to the right here and just select branch out to new workspace, give it a name, say, give the branch a name, say which branch I want it based on, give the new workspace a name. That will duplicate this particular workspace. It will copy over the metadata for all the supported items in Git integration. So if you're hoping to do this at this moment in time with Data Flows Gen 2, then that won't come over, but other items it will. And the supported items will appear in the new workspace for you. And CMIT has decided to come back now I finished that demo. So I've gone a bit further ahead than expected, but that is a Git integration demo for you all. So now let's talk about the suggested CI/CD workflow options from Microsoft, which I am going to get our moderator to share the link for as well. So you've all got awareness. So in September, Microsoft released a document about CI/CD workflow options. So I'm going to quickly go through how Azure DevOps fits into these suggested workflows. So first of all, I'm going to cover the recommended development process, and obviously you've just seen something relating to that already. So what Microsoft recommends is that actually you work in a feature workspace, or a workspace that represents a feature you're working on, preferably with a feature branch, which you've copied from your development environment. And you either work in this feature workspace, or you work on the metadata in something like, for example, Power BI Desktop. And then you save your changes and you synchronize them to your feature branch that you've got stored in Azure DevOps. So more precise, the feature branch that you've got in the Azure Repos service. And then from there, synchronize it to your main or dev branch, depending on your deployment strategy, like I was saying when I was answering the question earlier. Now, I'm saying that you can look to take it one step further by actually introducing unit tests or continuous integration tests. So, for example, here you can work with a Power BI report either directly in a feature workspace or locally in Power BI Desktop with Power BI Desktop projects. Have your Git repository locally if you're working on it locally. Synchronize it with your feature branch in Azure DevOps. And then when you go to do the pull request to actually merge your changes into your main or dev branch, actually run some continuous integration tests by having what's known as a branch policy in place in Azure Repos, which will run a pipeline. I will be showing a demo of this shortly, everybody. So that is my recommendation. It doesn't have to be just Power BI either. For example, you can use the data engineering framework made available by Microsoft. So if you're working with data pipelines, for example, every time you want to merge your pipeline changes, you can do continuous integration tests for those as well. So it does open up some good possibilities. And I kind of suspect Pragati is going to appear in a minute and tell me there's another question.
Yeah, I was just waiting for you to finish this slide, Kevin, because I was just thinking if you want to answer this question now or maybe after the demo, but as you spotted it, let's see. So this question comes from Gurgly, and he's asking, do you have any information when the report and semantic model will be fully supported in GA by Azure DevOps repo?
Oh, I'm not sure when it's actually going to be announced fully, when everything's fully 100% GA. There are a few things still to be ironed out. And as you will see in the demo shortly, if you use, for example, PBIR with the demo I'm about to show you, then you can potentially break your deployment pipelines. So I'm not sure yet when it'll all be fully supported. You can use a lot of this now already. So I would keep an eye on it if you're not utilizing PBIR. And my advice, if you are going to use something similar to what I'm showing, don't enable PBIR at this moment in time in Power BI Desktop. That's as much as I can tell you right now. I can't tell you any insights into when it's actually going to be all fully GA and supported and working together. But outside of the PBIR, you can still work with the metadata for Power BI and reports and semantic models now. You can even still do this continuous integration checks now. You can still work with Tyndall now. So if you want to enable Tyndall on Power BI Desktop, then feel free to do that. I hope that answers your question. Probably not fully the answer you want, but it gives you a bit of insight there.
Thanks, Kevin. We have got another question. Do you want to take it now?
Yeah, let's quickly take it now before I carry on.
Okay. So the another question comes from Muhammad, and he's asking, in case we have a lot of workspaces, nearly 40, that are normally mapped with teams, should I map one workspace to one project?
It's a very good question here. And I'm going to utilize my regular answer from my background of working as a performance tuning SQL Server, etc. It depends is the honest answer. It depends on your work scenario. I did do a blog post, as a lot of people know, some time ago relating to this. There is still a big debate about the number of workspaces to use, especially when you're working with development, test, acceptance, production environments. Best rule of thumb, and the best thing I recommend to everybody at this moment in time, use the least amount of workspaces that you need to until you do have to look to expand. So you can test if you want, mapping one workspace to one project. If you want to map multiple projects or workspace, you can do. Because what you can do is have them all split out to use the feature branches with the feature workspaces. Does mean they will all have to have permissions to actually be able to branch out to a new workspace. And then once they've worked on their features, you can merge it back into a development branch. And then you can do your lifecycle management for the different workspaces. Now, if you're using development, test, acceptance, production, that might be acceptable for you to actually merge them all until they get into one project. So you can have them all having, for example, separate development workspaces in the development environments, and then have them converge as you go across to, say, test and production. Or like I said, just have them all have separate feature ones and then merge them, consolidate them all in the development workspace.
Also, just to add,
yep.
Just to add, Kevin actually wrote a very good blog post on this, like how to work with Git integration with multiple workspaces. And I'm pasting that link in the chat. Maybe that can help you a bit more on understanding working with multiple workspaces.
Yeah, and you're more than welcome to reach out to me after this session, everybody. I'm fully contactable, and you can find me on a number of places online, as I showed earlier. Okay, so back to the topic at hand. I'm going to go through all the different deployment options for you all now. I've just shown the development options. So Microsoft give you 4 particular options here. I think it's 4 or 3. So first one is Git-based deployments, and this is where you deploy the multiple workspaces connected to the same Git repository. And you do this by working with multiple branches. So as you saw just now, you can use that kind of paradigm. So have your feature branches, then have a workspace that's backed by a dev branch to represent your development environment. Then when it goes to working in a workspace that represents the test environment, have that backed by a test Git branch, etc., etc. And here is a diagram to help you visualize this. Option 2, Git-based deployments using a build pipeline. So this is where you use Azure pipelines, basically. And Microsoft's current recommendation is that each workflow contains a build and release process. So a build for unit tests and another one to perform the updates. However, you can shift left and do your testing earlier, like I showed you just now with those continuous integration tests, and then use that to do or rely on that for when you do your builds to the environments. Do you note, though, that some of the APIs for Power BI, some of the APIs only support Power BI items at this moment in time? And if you want to work with service principals, if you want to use service principals for other Fabric items, then you're going to have to wait. And that is stated on the release plan. And I don't have any insight into when they will all fully be supported by service principals, just to preempt that question. So here's a diagram to help you visualize that scenario. So as you can see here, again, using this development process we talked about earlier, doing your merge, but then once you've merged to your main branch, for example, you can use that, the metadata stored in the main branch is your source of truth, which you then run the pipeline to deploy to your other stages. I have workspace here, but obviously it can be multiple workspaces. So just some quick recommendations here for Azure pipelines. I would consider working with YAML pipelines because I think personally they're more portable, because when you work with YAML pipelines, it stores a YAML file in your Git repository. So if you move that Git repository, all you have to do is reconnect to that YAML file again in Azure DevOps. Use self-hosted Azure pipeline agents to keep the pipelines secure. You can use Microsoft hosted ones. I do show some in the demos, which are going to be very quick demos today. Keep sensitive values in either variable groups or in the Azure key vault. In fact, what you can do is create variable groups in Azure DevOps, which are connected to an Azure Key Vault account, and then just get the secrets directly from there. The main thing to take away from this section, though, everybody, please do not store sensitive values in pipelines. Don't put hard code in your connection strings. Don't hard code in your server's principal, client ID, and secret. And preferably implement approvals process for production workloads. And you can do this by working with environments if you're working with YAML pipelines, or you can set up release gates if you're using the classic pipelines. Option 3 is by using Microsoft Fabric deployment pipelines. And I do appreciate that there is some confusion about terminology. So going back to what I showed you earlier, the development process, if you do your features and then you merge them into a branch that represents your development environment, you can then use that as the development stage or workspace in your deployment pipeline. And then from there, orchestrate using Microsoft Fabric deployment pipelines to deploy to your other stages. Alternatively, you can orchestrate to those Microsoft Fabric deployment pipeline stages using Azure DevOps. And I'll show you why this can be quite useful shortly. So here's some diagrams to help you visualize this. So this is when you do it with Fabric deployment pipelines. So here's the development process we talked about earlier up until here. And the rest of it you do in Microsoft Fabric with a nice click or through APIs. You can also orchestrate this in Azure pipelines. And the advantage of this is that then you get that approvals process that I talked about. So in fact, somebody would have to improve before it's deployed to production, but still using your Microsoft Fabric deployment pipeline stages. And in addition to that, it will give you some more flexibility as well. So as I mentioned earlier in this session, by default, when you go to deploy a container to another stage, all it will do is deploy the actual lakehouse name. So if you want to populate it at this moment in time, you'll have to consider using some form of data ops. And one way to do that is to run a notebook, as you can see here. So what you can do is, for example, update one of your Microsoft Fabric deployment pipeline stages. And then if you're orchestrating in Azure DevOps, call for the notebook to be run. And that will populate your lakehouse for you. Tenants. So what Microsoft recommend is to work with the development and test stages in your own tenant, and then deploy to the workspaces that are stored in the client tenants, your customer tenants, using Azure pipelines. And here's a diagram to help you visualize this. And I do have some demos for you all here. I will go through these very quickly because I still have our content to cover in 10 minutes. So let's quickly go in the Power BI desktop. And what I'll quickly show you here, if you go to File and then you go down to Options and Settings, and then click on Options, what you can do when the preview options appear, and of course I'm doing a live demo, so there's always going to be a delay. So if I click on Preview Features down here, you can see I've enabled to save Power BI projects. And of course, Power BI loses context every time I do this. So, which means when you go to File, I can actually save as a Power BI project. And it doesn't just save a file in PBIP format. It actually has a certain format that it stores, bit similar to when you save a database project. So here, it will save a folder which represents the metadata for your Power BI report, and another folder which represents the metadata for the semantic model. It's worth noting this only stores the metadata, not the data itself. I'm sure a lot of you have heard this already. And then what you can do is actually initialize the folders stored in a Git repository. So example in Azure, Visual Studio Code, initialize it here, add a remote repository stored in Azure DevOps. So basically, you can synchronize between the two. So the color, long story short, here is a synchronized version of the repository, and I can see I'm frozen a bit. So if I make a change, and I've got 10 minutes. I will very, very quickly show you this quickly in action. So what I'll do very quickly for you all, I'm just going to rename a page. Don't need to squint, just know that I'm renaming a page, making a very small change, just so I can save this. Once I've saved it, if I go to Visual Studio Code, because the folder that my Power BI project stored in is a local Git repository, recognizes a change. So I'm just going to quickly do here, change page name. I'm going to commit and synchronize the change. So what it's saying is synchronize the change with the repository in Azure DevOps. And when I hit refresh, you'll see that just now I made that change. And if I go back to my feature branch, you'll see that that change is being recognized. And I'm just going to update here. That will update my change for me. Well, I'll quickly show you all as well, because I want to show you this part. This is pretty important. You'll notice I've got a feature branch. And I've also got a workspace which is using a dev branch. What you need to do is create a pull request. And what I'm going to do is create a pull request from feature to dev. This is the fast version of this demo. And click on create. And once I've done it, you'll see I've actually got a pipeline running. And this is what I wanted to show you all, because the pipeline is running because if I click on branches here, and I click next to the dev branch, and I click on branch policies, I've got a branch policy in place on my dev branch. And all I'm saying is that every time someone tries to do a pull request to the dev branch, in other words, every time someone wants to do a merge, run a pipeline. And if we click on pipelines now, you can see this pipeline is running. If I click on edit, this is YAML. So quick introduction to YAML, but I'm not going to go through all of this. What this is doing is running checks against the semantic model using Tabular Editor. Once that's done, it will run checks against the report itself using PBI Inspector. It's worth noting this PBI Inspector version 2, which there is a PBI Inspector version 2 out now, which supports PBIR. But for the benefit of this demo, I'm using version 1. So if I go back to pull requests, you see it's still working, etc. And then once it's done the pull request, I can just approve and complete the change. And that means that my other workspace that uses a dev branch will be updated. I'm giving you the very short version of this demo. So in addition to all of this, I want to quickly show you all. This is a Microsoft Fabric deployment pipeline. This is the same workspace I showed you earlier that represents the development environment. So I can either navigate directly from here in deployment pipelines, or I can orchestrate the movement in Azure DevOps itself. So here, for example, I have a release pipeline where I can go through and update the different Microsoft Fabric deployment pipeline stages through APIs by orchestrating it in Azure DevOps. And as you can see here, this is where I can manage the approvals process. Right, so that's the short version. There are longer versions that I've done, which are available to you online, and I've got in-depth blog posts relating to all of this as well. However, we have 6 minutes to cover the last topic to hand, which it says CI/CD methods for data warehouses. but I will also be covering SQL database. So you can connect to data warehouse via connection string. So this allows you deployments through traditional CI/CD methods. So for example, I can use a DAT pack. You can use migration base as well, but there are potential caveats. One of those being that some of the migration base applications, well, offerings available, don't fully work. And it supports working database projects in a number of different places, which means CI/CD can be performed in an Azure DevOps pipeline. Now, as you can see here, this is one potential way you can do it. However, it does not just apply to data warehouses now. As I mentioned earlier, SQL databases in Fabric are now available. And in fact, I will put a link in the chat relating to these. Well, which means, as I showed you all earlier, so if I go back in the Fabric very quickly for you all. If we go back to the database repository I showed you earlier. So if I click on any of these, so as you can see, I'm directly working with a SQL database in Fabric. It is stored in Fabric. Behind the scenes is working with the traditional SQL Server files. And what it actually does, it works with those files, does all the things that you tend to do with a transactional database, and then it actually forwards the data of any changes into OneLake. So as you can see, you can also connect that through here. So if I go, for example, if I clicked on Visual Studio Code, it would give me the connection details. Just like with data warehouses, I can get the connection string, which means we can perform CI/CD for SQL databases in Fabric as well. Here are two particular methods you can do it. So one method is that you can actually extract it directly from what you can do is create a database project based on the SQL database in Fabric, or, apologies there, or we can actually directly extract the schema of a SQL database in Fabric into a DAT pack file, and then use the contents of that DAT pack file to deploy updates to one or more SQL databases in Fabric. Now, I can show you how doing this for data warehouse projects and SQL databases in Fabric looks. I'll even make the resolution bigger. I'm showing demos in Azure Data Studio. And if you're doing this in Azure Data Studio, you need to have the SQL Database Projects extension installed. And what that will allow you to do is to, for example, connect up to either a Fabric data warehouse or a SQL database in Fabric. And I can right click, select create project from database, fill in this nice wizard, and then I get a database project, like you can see here. So from here, I can then synchronize it in the Azure DevOps and do all the deployments as you have been able to do for years for SQL Server, Azure SQL Database, etc. However, you can do exactly the same here for SQL Database and Fabric. So here's a database project based on SQL Database and Fabric instead. As you can see, both of them use a database project. Microsoft have now very kindly started doing a lot of documentation relating to SQL database projects, and there is quite good Microsoft material, which I will put in the chat for you all now. So once you've got this database project, like I said, what you can do in Azure DevOps, you can then either create that pack. So for example, here, if I bring this particular pipeline, you can actually create the DAT pack based on the contents of the database project I showed you just now. Or you can extract the schema from an existing SQL database in Fabric by using PowerShell, and then create the DAT pack and publish it from there. Either way, you will still end up with a DAT pack file once you've done that build. So if I click on there, for example, you'll see that I've got an artifact created that contains my DAT pack. Whichever way you choose, once you've got that DAT pack, then you can just deploy it using the same way you've deployed updates to, for example, SQL Server, Azure SQL Database, etc. in the past. So we'll go to releases here. I'm dead on time. Just give me one moment and I will wrap up. So here, as you can see, I just take the DAT pack and then deploy it. Appreciate this is the speedy version of this demo, because I've got in-depth blog posts on how to do this. And in addition to that, and something I wanted to show you all now, if you go to the Fabric community site, you'll see now there's a whole set of blogs by members of the community in what's known as the Fabric community blogs. Literally an hour before this session, one of my posts were published on here. But as you can see, there's a whole variety of posts from other esteemed members of the community. So, for example, people relating for data engineering, and one there. And for example, not just data engineering, we can go to the community blog as well. And if we scroll down, oh, that's a very lengthy one by somebody. There are other posts down here as well. There's this post from somebody. The name sounds a bit familiar, but they've recently published as well to help answer the question earlier about on-premises SQL to a Fabric Lakehouse. You may want to use this alternative post on the community website as well. Big thank you, by the way, moderator today. So that's it. We have gone a little bit over. Are there any other questions from anybody?
First of all, thank you, Kevin, for this session. I think I also needed a lot of things to learn from this session, and thank you so much. I think I refreshed a lot of knowledge around Git integration in Fabric, and everyone. One thing to point here is Kevin is an expert in CI/CD. So please reach out to him and follow his blog, because he has a big name in the community for this particular topic. And he has wrote amazing blogs where people like myself have learned a lot. So definitely go and check out his blogs. And I've posted some of his blog links while he was doing the session. So definitely go and check those links around Git integration. And thank you, Kevin, for highlighting my blog there at the community.
That's fine. I hadn't realized somebody done a very long preview beforehand, but I wanted to do it. So yeah, like Pragati said, everybody, the demos, a lot of them are the speedy version, and that's because I have very in-depth blog posts for all of these anyway. So you can go in, you can get all the details in. I always go into a lot of detail. I give it a lot of depth. I share a lot of links. And of course, I'm always contactable by everybody as well if there's any questions.
Yeah, so currently I don't see any questions, but no. I'm sure. Yeah, but still it was very, but still it was very interactive session, Kevin, because we had a few good questions coming from the audience, and I'm sure everyone can reach out to you after the session as well if they've got anything more to ask. Okay, so in that case, I think we are going to wrap up, and thank you, Kevin, for your session. And yeah, I've already shared links to Kevin's social links there. So please go and follow Kevin, and especially if you're interested in CI/CD, definitely go and check out his blog. It's something, I mean, you really need to bookmark, as I have bookmarked his blog for many things as well. So I think we have come to an end today, and this was an amazing session. And thank you everyone for joining the last session of 2024 for our user group. And I hope everyone learned something new from it. And as I said, Kevin is expert in this topic, so I'm sure everyone have good comments around it. So thank you everyone. And I just wish you all happy holidays and hope you enjoy a great time with your family. And then we are going to see you soon in the new year with amazing content with new speakers. So definitely tune into our LinkedIn page and Twitter announcements for the new sessions that we're going to bring in the new year. So thank you everyone for joining today, and happy holidays, Merry Christmas, and a Happy New Year in advance. Thank you everyone.